Hello and welcome to AM Guitar with me, Anjay. Today we are going to look at 3 commonly used overdrives. Tube Screamer Mini in this case, the Nobels ODR1 and the Boss SD-1. Now then, there are many conversations and arguments about what's the difference between an overdrive and a distortion. General reasoning being that distortion is hard clipping, so it does more to the signal, whereas overdrive is soft clipping, so it doesn't do as much to the signal, theoretically, and it's meant to emulate a tube amp more. Now, there's a potted history of why and how tube screamers and kind of overdrives came to exist. It's sort of accepted that the Boss OD1 was the first proper overdrive that wasn't a distortion or a fuzz, that was being used to make something that sounded a bit more like a tube amp without having to really hammer amps. Because to get a tube amp to distort, you had to have a lot of volume. So people realised that if you were to push the preamp in a tube amp, you could get that kind of nice breakup without having to have the volume at kind of deafening levels. And the idea of kind of an overdrive at that point was to try and get to that clipping without all of the huge amounts of volume needed. So the OD1 came about and it had a drive and a level, I believe, as just 2 controls. And the drive used this soft clipping where it added a bit of clipping to your guitar signal before it got to the amp, and then pushed the preamp in the amplifier as well. So you got that kind of overdrivey breakup before you got to huge volumes. Maxon created the, let me get this right, the Maxon, I think it was the OD808 originally. When interviewed, the creator said that he was trying to get you to a point where you could have distortion or clipping coming from the pedal and mixing it with the clipping in the amp to get something which sounded much more overdriven without the volume. So that kind of rings true. That then became the TS808 when Ibanez bought it, and then kind of overdrives went from there. So the Super Overdrive is an evolution of the OD1, the original kind of Boss Overdrive. The Maxon, or the Tube Screamer, sorry, was originally designed as a competitor and to kind of basically clone the OD1. So the SD-1 and the Tube Screamer, which evolved from the Maxon OD808, should sound about the same. There's not a lot of difference. You get asymmetrical clipping in the TS. I don't think you do in the SD-1, I might be wrong, but either way, they are slightly different circuits, but they should give you a very similar sound. The Nobels is very different and has a much kind of broader spectrum. So these both give you that kind of that mid hump that you would associate with overdrive, which is what people talk about. Whereas the ODR1 was meant to give you a slightly more what they call transparent. So it doesn't push any particular frequencies any harder than any other frequencies. It does colour it, but not quite to the same extent as these two, which you're going to see in a minute. So I'm going to put this on the ground, we're going to set it all up, get a loop playing through it and just mess around with them and see what we get. Okay then, we're all set up. I have got the 3 different overdrives with a looper going into them, going straight into my Harley Benton Tube 5 tube amp. Everything's at about 12 o'clock on the amp. We're not a breakup or anything like that. Hoping we'll see if this pushes it into breakup and something sounding natural. Here is a clean tone for you. Alright, so we're going to start with stuff around 12 o'clock. I've set all of the volumes to be equal already. We're not going to mess with the volumes, we're going to mess with the gain to start with. So, as expected, the Tube Screamer and the Super Overdrive sound very, very similar, with that kind of mid boost that you're expecting, where the ODR1 has a lot more bass, a lot less of a mid boost, and sounds a little bit fuller. And obviously, you start to get that nice tubey overdrive. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to turn the drives all the way down, and we're going to just play with the volume and the tone and see what we can get. So what we can see there is that the ODR1 doesn't push the amp anywhere near as hard as the Tube Screamer and the Super Overdrive. So if I start pushing the spectrum up on the ODR1, let's see what we get from that. As you push the spectrum up, you start to get the natural breakup on the amp. Now what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to get all of them so they're pushing the amp. I'm then going to roll the volume back slightly and use the drive to start to get you that tubey sound again. So there again, you can kind of hear that the Super Overdrive and the Tube Screamer push the amp quite early on, but again, that mid-hump becomes very, very pronounced very, very quickly. Whereas the ODR1 has a much smoother, far less kind of harsh and aggressive sound to it. Now, obviously, there are pros and cons to both, but let's play with the drive and see how far each of these drives takes us. So I'm going to bring the levels back down to kind of where they were originally. Leave the tones alone. And we're going to start rolling the drive as far up as we can and see what we get. And again, we hear that the Super Overdrive and the Tube Screamer are really, really close to each other. So I'm going to set everything back to 12 o'clock on the drives, get the levels about even again. And this time we're going to just play with rolling the tone around and see what sort of differences we get from that. So again, the ODR1 gives you a much, much fuller response. Tube Screamer and Super Overdrive, barely a hair in it. I think the Tube Screamer has a slightly more pronounced sort of top end to it. But one of the best things to do with overdrives is to stack them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what it sounds like to have the Tube Screamer type overdrive going into the ODR1 and then the ODR1 going into the Super Overdrive. And just sort of show you what sort of things you can get from that as well. So if we bring everything back up to 12, and then I'm going to reduce the overdrive on the Tube Screamer, and I'll reduce the overdrive on the other two, and we're going to play around with just stacking them and see how they sound. So as you can see, if you put the Tube Screamer into the ODR1, you start to hear that slightly more pronounced mid. Also, and I'll show you this on the other pedals, but if you start to increase the level of the pedal that is going into the other pedal, rather than hearing a volume increase in the second pedal, what you hear is it gets more overdriven as the clipping gets hit hard, as the clipping diodes get hit harder. So what you can do is you can use this to thicken up a distortion without needing to mess around with the drive on the second pedal. So again, this one's now on full volume. In fact, actually, if I put it onto half volume and I turn the gain off on here entirely, you can hear that even without changing the gain on here, I start to get more drive. So let's see what happens if we put the ODR1 into a more Tube Screamer-like drive on the Super Overdrive. Because the ODR1 has a much less pronounced mid-hump, you get far less EQ change to the Super Overdrive, but you do get a little bit more guts to that distortion again. So again, it's pushing those clipping diodes. So one more time, I'll put the drive on the Super Overdrive to 0, and we'll just start pushing it with the level on this ODR1. And into the ODR1, into the SD-1, you start to get a slight volume boost purely because the ODR1 pushes more of the frequencies. Let's just try Tube Screamer into a Super Overdrive just for fun, and then we'll stack all of them and have done with it. And you can hear, not only do you get the sort of the slightly more gain in there, you're getting a mid-hump hitting a mid-hump, creating a bigger mid-hump. So this would push through a mix really easily. So if you were to turn the drive off on the Super Overdrive, you're using the Tube Screamer as your main drive, you'd then turn this on for the solo. And because you're pushing through with the mids and the high ends, you don't need quite as much volume to push through the mix. Right, let's get them all on together and then see if the world caves in. So everything back to 12. And let us see. Well, there you go. I think it's pretty obvious that Tube Screamer and the SD-1 are very, 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 very similar. I think the Tube Screamer has a bit more top end, and it's more pleasing to my ears, actually. I always preferred the SD-1, but comparing them like this, I've actually preferred the Tube Screamer a lot more. It just seems to have a bit more clarity to it. The Nobels is a totally different beast altogether. It doesn't sound like an overdrive. Once you hit the, or as much as an overdrive, once you hit the kind of the real heavy gain on it, it starts to be a bit more of a distortion pedal. And I personally prefer it as kind of a bass tone, just getting a little bit of breakup without pushing any of the frequencies too much, and then stacking it into a Tube Screamer. So on my board, the Nobels comes first, then I've got Tube Screamer as kind of a solo boost, and also just a stack, because I like stacking gains. What's your favourite? What do you think? Are you a SD man? Are you a woman? Are you a Tube Screamer person? Are you a Nobels person? Has this video made you want to try a Nobels or try a different overdrive? Let me know your favourite overdrives in the comments. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Cheers.